Well, would you look at that? A non-Yu-Gi-Oh video from me. I knew I had it in myself. Anyways, let's talk about Danganronpa. At the time of writing this, I'm a pretty new fan, having only gotten into the series about a couple months ago. While I do enjoy stuff like the gameplay, the comedy, the mystery, and, of course, the big fat juicy lore, I think the characters are by far and away my favorite things about these games. Seriously, I feel like I fall in love with at least half of the characters in each game, and that's something I honestly wasn't expecting when going in. From looking at numerous videos and tier list rankings, something I've found is that every character has a devoted fan base. Sure, I and many others don't care for Hifumi, but I know there's plenty of people out there who do, and I think that's really fascinating. The idea that any character, no matter how annoying or bland to some, is the favorite of dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of others. Not so subtle segue into Hiyoko. If you look around at the general consensus on Hiyoko, you'll see that she's pretty consistently one of the most disliked characters. So, of course, she'd be my favorite. What can I say? I root for the underdogs. I mean, Mondo and Ryoma are my favorites from their respective games, and I'm pretty sure those two aren't even in the top 10 most beloved in said games. But Hiyoko is one of those characters where I feel like you get questioned for saying she's your favorite for several reasons, but I still enjoy her, and something that I think many can agree on is that her character was kinda sorta severely mishandled. Now, that's not something exclusive to Hiyoko, of course. Characters like Kiyotaka and Ryoma also tend to be viewed as ones who got their arcs cut short, but I think it's pretty messed up in her case because without proper development, she just didn't get enough positive scenes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, here's how the video is going to go down. Part 1 will be an overview of Hiyoko herself, and Part 2 will go over her mishandling in the game, how I would adjust it, and my thoughts on some possible behind-the-scenes decisions. And I'm just going to get this out of the way now. I am not an expert, I am not a game designer, nor am I a psychologist. So some of my thoughts on Hiyoko may be seen as reading too much into something, or even bordering on headcanon, but it's my video, so we're gonna roll with my perception. Before we get into Hiyoko's backstory, I think we need to address the elephant, or ant, in the room. Hiyoko straight up sucks in the main story. Our first interaction with her is getting to watch her crush ants one by one, which, when combined with her dialogue, I think shows us two important aspects of her character. One is that it shows her childlike side. Kids step on ants and think it's fun, and the fact that she calls them Mr. Ant just adds this layer of childlike innocence to it. An innocence that is immediately stripped away like 10 minutes later when she wants to find and kill a snake, and then like 5 minutes after that, when she's mad she can't step on any crabs. I don't think you need me to tell you that this is pretty intense behavior for a high schooler, but maybe we can dismiss it. Outside of like one time early on in her free time events, her animal genocide is really only contained here in the very beginning, and doesn't really come up any other times. She's also pretty manipulative, showing joy over how gullible Akane is, and faking crying as soon as people get on her case. Then there's the thing she's most infamous for, her verbal bullying. Given her pathetic stature, it's completely understandable why she doesn't get physical with her classmates. To make up for that, she takes jabs at and insults nearly everyone around her, although particularly Kazuichi and especially Mikan. The reason for this is because they're the ones who show the most reaction to her insults, as Hiyoko states that Akane isn't as fun to bully because of just how easy it is to screw with her. And while it may seem like Mikan is the person she hates the most in her class, that title actually belongs to Sonia, whom Hiyoko is jealous of due to the attention she receives from the other students. So this tells us something about who is safe from Hiyoko's repeated bullying, or at least lets us infer. She doesn't bully people she's scared of, and she doesn't bully people who aren't receptive to it. Let's look at our cast and narrow down our potential victims, shall we? Nekomaru and Peko are very clearly physically stronger, and possibly intimidating to Hiyoko. Nagito gives everyone the willies and openly admits to trying to kill Togami in the first trial, so it makes sense Hiyoko wouldn't screw with him. We've already discussed why she doesn't target Akane too much, but I think Chiaki is a similar case, where Hiyoko's bullying just has no effect on her, so she didn't keep trying it. And I think Ibuki and Gundam could also fit in here as well. Although for Ibuki, it's worth noting that Hiyoko seems to like her more than most, since Hiyoko likes her style of music. Sonya, despite being Hiyoko's least favorite, was also likely exempt because the bullying either wouldn't get to her, or because Hiyoko believed she had her own defense squad of worshippers ready to protect her at any given moment. She messed with Togami a fair bit as well, giving him the nickname Ham Hands, although since they didn't get too many interactions, it's hard to say how their relationship would have panned out in the long run. Mahiru was nice to her, and they obviously became super close at the start of Chapter 2, so she's off the list as well. That leaves us with 5 available fellas: Teruteru, Fuyuhiko, Kazuichi, Hajime, and Mikan. Teruteru doesn't last long, so we don't get too much between the two. But she is pretty quick to call him out on his pervy behaviors and sus accent, so I think it's fair to say that had he lasted longer, she would have been roasting him like meat on the bone. Fuyuhiko is an interesting one, since he does bite back when Hiyoko pokes at him, although Hiyoko likely wasn't too afraid of him seeing as how she calls him babyface, and they're both practically the same size. Hiyoko picks on Hajime every now and then, but I think it's because he has a weird balance. He doesn't scare her off or fight back too much, but he also doesn't get too visibly or audibly shaken up by her insults. There's also her FTEs, which I'll get into later. Kazuichi is probably her second most consistent target, likely because her insults actually get to him. And since he's a pretty emotional guy, I can't exactly blame him. Finally, we have Mikan, who is just completely unable to stand up for herself and has some sort of panicked reaction to just about every insult Hiyoko hurls her way. I'll also add that while I haven't seen exact translations, I've been told that Hiyoko's insults were more childish and less intense than the English version made her out to be. Again, I don't know if this is true. If anybody knows, I'd be glad to hear more about it. Just echoing some stuff I've heard. I'm tempted to believe it, seeing as how this series has had translation issues in the past, such as the schizo thing in the first game, Gonta's speech patterns, and numerous other things that were made less apparent in the English version than the Japanese. So when you look at everything like that, I think it makes sense that Mikan is Hiyoko's primary target. Bullies like getting reactions, and they like seeing signs of weakness. By reacting how she does, Mikan essentially tells Hiyoko that she'll always get a reaction out of saying something about her. It's kind of an awkward position to be in, because I feel like telling Mikan to grow a backbone and stand up for herself might be asking a bit much, but at the same time, she needs to give Hiyoko some sign to stop picking on her, and that just never happens. Or, at the very least, somebody else needs to stand up on her behalf. Hiyoko also believes Mikan's clumsiness and tripping into suggestive poses is merely an act to gain attention and pity, which, to be fair, is a possibility, because what are the odds of something like this happening twice in one chapter, and then never again over the next 2? So now we know why Hiyoko targets who she does for her bullying, but we still haven't really discussed why she's a bully to begin with. So in order to do that, we need to cover her backstory. In a series where nearly every character has a tragic backstory of some sort, Hiyoko stands out as possibly one of the most depressing. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to compare here or make it some sort of suffering contest. I'd just like to shed some light on a sad backstory that I don't think gets brought up as much as it should. Hiyoko was born as the heiress to the Saionji clan, an influential family who served as the head of the school of traditional Japanese dance. Not only was her family very overbearing because of their traditionalist roots, but they, and by extent Hiyoko, were frequently targeted by jealous people with way too much time on their hands. As early as childhood, Hiyoko was dealing with having sharp objects put in her shoes, dead mice scattered on her bed, and having a stage light intentionally dropped on her head. If that wasn't bad enough, Hiyoko also has some parental issues. She loved her father, who was very protective and supportive of her, and he actually didn't want her to become the head of the family that she was destined to be. However, because he married into the family, he was pretty low on the totem pole, and as a result, Hiyoko was taken from him by her grandmother and mother. Between her parents and her grandmother, Hiyoko has a mixed range of feelings. She absolutely loves her father, absolutely hates her mother, and has mixed thoughts on her grandma. She's grateful that she took care of her, but she also calls her a hag, and is quick to insult her. This is interesting because while the connection is never made directly in-game, this likely ties into Hiyoko's lack of an ability to do much for herself other than dancing. The only thing we really see this in full force with is her lack of an ability to tie her own kimono, which, considering that it's something she presumably wears very often, is a pretty telling thing. Hiyoko spells it out pretty blatantly during the beginning of Chapter 3. When everyone is talking about how off-putting her shrine to my hero is, she openly says she's clumsy at everything other than dancing. If you think about it, this could also tie into Hiyoko's hatred of Mikan as well. Hiyoko believes Mikan's clumsiness is all an act, and a desperate attempt for attention. Because she is self-conscious about her own clumsiness and lack of an ability to do anything other than dancing. Clumsy and pathetic as Mikan may be, Mikan is still the ultimate nurse, a talent Hiyoko herself acknowledges. I can see that being a sore spot and a point of jealousy for her. That's just a theory. Of course, and like many other things in this video, it's just my own thoughts and interpretations. I'm gonna kinda have to make that known since this character is only alive for 2.5 chapters and like 15 minutes of the anime, and she really wasn't massively relevant in either. Hiyoko's bitter personality and need to continue bullying are a defense mechanism in order to keep others away from her, because she's afraid to let others get close to her in the first place. The one person she was close with in her family was taken away from her, and constant attempts on her life from complete strangers left her too afraid to get close to anyone. So if she acts like a brat, people presumably won't be able to get close to her, and as a result betray or be taken from her. She kinda does this in her free time events, usually saying something kind or profound, but then immediately retreating back to her normal petty insults. If not that, then she'll boss Hajime around and tell him to do unreasonable things like stealing Gundam's earring, or just outright telling him that he's her slave. In her third event, she threatens to kill Hajime, which is a betrayal of her true feelings, as she hates murder, going as far as to condemn and hate Teruteru after his death, something nobody else seems to have felt. She says some snarky stuff to Hajime like usual, although she gives some actual profound insight into her views on traditionalism, which, while maybe a bit much, shows she has a genuine care for protecting things of the past. After Hajime compliments her on this, she immediately follows up by saying something off-putting. After this, Hajime shows interest in seeing her dance, to which she responds by getting flustered and saying something truly kind, that her father said the same thing, and that she'd make sure to invite Hajime to her next performance. While she does throw a loose threat at him in the end there, this was a genuinely kind moment from her, especially when you consider how much her dad means to her. Comparing Hajime to her dad is like the highest praise he could get, really. Her final event primarily focuses on her jealousy towards Sonya, and how everyone pampers her like the princess that she is. She acts upset when Hajime says he doesn't want to pick sides, after which she cries, causing him to reluctantly say he's on her side. She gets happy about this, but then claims that her emotions were just manipulating Hajime. However, Hajime, and likely the player, don't really buy that. This is another instance of Hiyoko trying to play off her true emotions, because deep down, she does want people to tell her they're on her side, as much as she's unwilling to say it out loud. I think this plays a big role in how she befriended my hero as quickly as she did. If she's in a genuinely vulnerable position, then she'll practically fall in love with the person who helps her. In the non-canon DR3 manga, we actually see this happen with Mikan, of all people. While walking to school, Hiyoko and Mahiro accidentally bump into Mikan, and after some usual aggressive commentary, Hiyoko tries to run away, only to trip over her sandals and scrape her knee. Mikan offers her hand to help her up, clean her wound and bandage it, but Hiyoko, seeing Mikan was hurt too after they bumped into her, ran off. Later on, Mikan is able to meet with Hiyoko one-on-one in the infirmary, and after having her wound bandaged, Hiyoko actually shows regret over hurting Mikan earlier. You'd think she would blame her because clumsy old Mikan, but not only does she own up to it, but she also offers to take care of Mikan's wound. In response, Mikan compliments Hiyoko and calls her kind, which she tries to play off as simply returning a favor, although Mikan seems to see through it. The chapter ends with the two walking back to class, holding hands, and Hiyoko isn't fighting it. Now again, I have to reiterate, different writers, non-canon, and from a manga that is mostly comedic in nature, so think of it what you will. But while these events never canonically transpired, this whole thing doesn't really feel out of character. I could genuinely see Hiyoko using that situation to bury the hatchet with Mikan and finally befriend her.
No, that's wrong!
Okay, that's fair. I guess I should get into part 2 now, huh? Yeah, dog, Hiyoko was a victim in Chapter 3, and wasn't very important in Chapter 1. Game 2, Chapter 3 has been talked about to death by this point. It's commonly regarded as one of the worst, if not the worst in the trilogy. But first, I'd like to clear up a common misconception that I see all too frequently. Yes, I am of course talking about the infamous half-truth that is Survivor Hiyoko and Chapter 3 victim Fuyuhiko. I bet some of you were already typing that out. Well, no, that's wrong. Wait, I just used that one. Hold on a sec.
The fog is lifted.
Let's get this out of the way. Hiyoko was in fact originally intended to be a survivor, although there's no evidence to suggest Fuyuhiko was supposed to be the one to die in her place. That was Nekomaru, as Fuyuhiko was supposed to be roboticized during Pekko's execution and die later, presumably Chapter 4. This is all explained pretty well in a video by Mozilla Vulpix with a criminally low amount of views. This didn't end up happening, as Kodaka didn't think the more comedic nature of the robot character would suit Fuyuhiko's serious arc, and he also didn't want a girl to become a robot, so with limited options, Nekomaru became a robot in the final game. I think it also makes sense given that Fuyuhiko and Nekomaru basically swapped early designs, with the team manager originally being small and the Yakuza being big. Not only would this mean that Mikan killing Nekomaru would have actually been feasible, but also that the design for Nekomaru may have already existed and just belonged to Fuyuhiko at the time. This is all just speculation on my end and none of this is confirmed, but I do think it is possible. Now that that's cleared up, let's talk about the issues with Hiyoko's death. 1. Her character development began at the start of this chapter, so killing her here cuts it really short, which is a bad idea for a character who needed development as badly as she did. 2. Her murder weapon is just never mentioned. We know that she had her throat slit, and because Mikan was the killer, I think the most logical assumption would be a scalpel. This is interesting because to my knowledge, this is the only murder trial in the trilogy where a murder weapon is outright never acknowledged. You don't even look for it or say anything about how you can't find it. It's just completely swept under the rug. And 3, her death was purely coincidental, only occurring because she just so happened to walk in on the crime scene, so she died to tie up a loose end. This makes her death feel almost tacked on just to make a double murder, an issue that happens in V3 funnily enough. Out of all the murders in the trilogy, this is the chapter where they feel the least personal, and the most like the writers just wanted to get rid of these characters. But they also had to get rid of more than one because, hey, might as well make a double murder the theme of Chapter 3, right? I, and many others, have passed around ideas of who we believe should have died in Hiyoko's place. And honestly, Hajime, Chiaki, and Nagito are basically the only characters I haven't seen people suggest as the second victim. Out of all the alternative victims, though, I think Sonya is just the best alternative for a few reasons. 1. She doesn't really go on to contribute a ton, and is mostly used for either comedic relief or an occasional emotional moment, both of which are things I think Hiyoko could do just as well. If not Hiyoko, somebody else could do it. 2. Her death would have been an easy inclusion that wouldn't change the story. Simply have her offer to go grab the mirror from the venue and bring it back to Hiyoko. Hiyoko, who is now willing to be more vulnerable, agrees with this, and just like when Hiyoko entered the venue, Sonya would walk in on Mikan and be killed. And the third, and most important reason, is the development it gives not only Hiyoko, but also Kazuichi and Gundam, the two guys who liked Sonya as more than just an acquaintance. Imagine how Hiyoko would have felt after having yet another person die after they did something nice for her. Play into her insecurity. Sonya was the person she disliked the most, but maybe in that moment, Hiyoko's feelings changed because Sonya was helping her like Mahiru, only to die before Hiyoko could apologize or get to know her better. I also can't help but feel that Sonya's death would have gotten a more emotional reaction out of the players. Ibuki was a sweet character that most players didn't hate, and as a result, her death was sad for most to see. Hiyoko, on the other hand, was a character many players actively disliked, and as a result, reactions to her death were much more mixed. From watching Let's Plays, I generally saw much more, "Oh no, not Ibuki," than "No, not Hiyoko." Maybe that's because of the shock of seeing double murder, but I really do think it's because most people just weren't as sad about Hiyoko dying. They're still sad because somebody died, but when they see who it is, it wouldn't have been the same sadness as if it was basically any other member of the cast at that point. The only time I saw genuine sympathy directed at Hiyoko was during the Bittersweet Gamers playthrough, which, if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend doing so, because they actually dive deep into Hiyoko as a character during the episode when she dies. I think there was a lot of missed opportunities for character interactions after she started being better. Imagine if she finally apologized to Mikan, or told Sonya how she felt about her, or even begrudgingly befriended Fuyuhiko. It could have been great. Hiyoko was kind of in a challenging position to begin with. Characters like Byakuya, Nagito, and Kokichi are very polarizing, and they're characters who last longer and have more time for development. Making a character who intentionally has unlikable traits is tricky, because already people aren't going to like them, regardless of any amazing development they get. Killing her off halfway through the game after only teasing development is just a disaster, and basically the nail in the coffin that ensured she'd be towards the bottom of most fans' character rankings. Hiyoko was kind of the perfect storm, really, and the only other similar case I can think of would be Angie. You know, another girl who was mostly unlikable in the main story and is killed and attacked on death because she walked in somewhere before we really get to see another side to her. I do still believe Hiyoko was handled worse, if only because we got a tease of her starting to turn around, which made the death feel like a slap in the face from someone wearing a metal gauntlet. Something I will concede is that I can see why it was decided Hiyoko had to die. When I think about it, Hiyoko and Fuyuhiko have a lot in common. They're both small, angry, foul-mouthed blondes who wear one color with talents tied to traditional Japanese backgrounds, and both lose their friend in Chapter 2. Oh, wait a minute. Blonde, antagonistic, but not evil, wearing one color, last name Saionji. Wait, did they predict Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s? Was I making a Yu-Gi-Oh! Video this whole time? What was I saying? Oh right, Hiyoko and Fuyuhiko have a lot in common, and as a result, I can see the writers feeling like having both survive wouldn't be the best idea, especially because this game has one less survivor than the previous. Danganronpa has had quite a few similar characters across the trilogy: Aoi and Akane, Sakura and Nekomaru, or Hifumi and Teruteru. Those are some examples, but I can't think of an instance where there were two characters who had this much in common that were in the same game. I imagine they weighed their options and saw Fuyuhiko as the character worth keeping, which I truly cannot fault them for. He had great development and he's like in my top 10, so clearly they did something right there. The two had very similar arcs, and maybe they felt that having both survive would make the arc feel less special, and maybe someone else should have been a survivor instead. That would have had more variety. While we obviously don't know the specifics, the interview with Kodaka I mentioned earlier has something interesting at the end. Apparently, had Fuyuhiko died as planned, there would have been only one male survivor, which means one of two things. Either Kazuichi was also planned to die, or he wasn't factoring in Hajime and was referring to male characters in addition to him. Excluding Hajime, there would have been 4 survivors, with 3 of them being girls. I can see them deciding to swap one of them out for a boy, and that boy being Fuyuhiko. Between Akane, Sonya, and Hiyoko, I can see how cutting Hiyoko may have been the best choice in their eyes. Akane had a substantial arc after the death of Nekomaru, and Sonya, while not having too much to do in the story, wouldn't have been unique in that regard. In the first game, the only trial Aoi plays a major role in was the 4th, and while Hiro was important in the 3rd and 4th trials, he was also mostly a comic relief who left many fans scratching their heads with how he actually managed to get out of that killing game with his life. Similarly, Sonya is just kinda there for most of the game, and while I'd argue that every DR2 survivor could be classed as comedic relief to an extent, that paired with Sonya's lack of serious presence in the story makes me feel like she was intended to be a Yasuhiro-like character, and the writers had no intention of killing her off at any point. Again, just my perspective and over-analysis. They should be calling me the ultimate detective, really. I'll also add this perspective from Reddit user u/SHSL Saionji Stan, a fellow Hiyoko philosopher. In response to a comment stating they believed Hiyoko was going back to her old ways shortly before her death, they had this to say. To paraphrase, they assert that seeing Nekomaru die sort of caused Hiyoko to relapse and act rude again during the last segments of her screen time. Her arc was meant to offer a contrast to Fuyuhiko. Whereas he truly improved and turned around, Hiyoko tried to, only to end up dying herself in an attempt to honor Mahiru. Of course, that's just another perspective, and take it however you will because it is interesting to think about. It really isn't new for the franchise either, with Taka going down a somewhat similar path in the first game. At first, you think he's eventually going to drop the Kyondo thing and go back to being himself, with some of that Mondo influence, but he just dies before he can get the chance. And it does fit for the series where despair is such a prevalent theme. Sometimes, an unforeseen death takes people away before they can get a chance to turn their life around. In Danganronpa, the number one rule is to never get attached, because anyone could die in any chapter. While from our point of view, we would have liked Hiyoko to survive and get development, that kind of plot armor just didn't exist for her in-universe. As much as I may dislike the decision to kill her off, primarily because her not getting development has permanently made her one of the most hated characters in the franchise, it was a decision that makes sense given the narrative and themes of the series. Hello everyone, Future Emerald here. We're just about at the end of the video here, but there was some stuff I figured I missed in the original script in recording, so I'm adding that here. One is that I fully understand that another reason people don't like Hiyoko is that she doesn't help in either of the 2 trials she's in. And that's fair. I'm not gonna pretend she did much of anything, but I'll just say that I personally don't have lack of plot contributions affect my enjoyment of characters. I know it's something some people get hung up on. I'm not one of those people. Another thing I'll add is that in the Danganronpa 3 anime, there's a scene where Hiyoko states that only she is left. I don't know. It's just a short scene that isn't built upon, just my interpretation of it. There's also another scene where Mikan saves Hiyoko from an attacker, and while Hiyoko initially says something rude, she actually comes to thank her, and Mikan cries about it, and I think that's another good scene. I just think the 2 have a really interesting dynamic, and in some ways they kind of parallel each other. Like Mikan just craves attention. She practically offers herself up on a platter for it. But to contrast, Hiyoko hates attention in group settings and even tries to push away other people out of fear that she'll be separated from them. And Mikan is implied to have suffered sexual abuse, and Hiyoko is implied to have a massive chunk of her fan base be grown men who are more interested in her youthful appearance than her actual dancing. Both of them also share the conflict of questioning their usefulness, with Hiyoko believing she's bad at everything other than dancing, in Mikan's free time events, having her repeatedly offer herself up to Hajime to just be used, pretty much. And lastly, you know, I just kind of threw that in there to just kind of leave something else to think about. I originally planned to put that earlier in the video, but when I wrote the script, I didn't have it. Then I recorded everything, and I didn't want to throw it back in there. I feel like that would have disrupted the flow of that part of the video. But lastly, I think I'll just kind of leave you with my purpose for making this video, which I really had two. First, as unlikely as it may be, I hope this made some of you out there like Hiyoko a bit more. I don't know if I got my points across the best. If not, maybe it'll at least allow you to examine her from another angle. I get that Hiyoko's redeeming qualities are pretty few and far between, especially in the main story. You really have to kind of dig into free time events and other side media to really get that stuff. But if characters like Junko can become beloved because she's funny and stuff like that, and other actual murderers can get a pass because they had sympathy as to why they did it, I feel like Hiyoko deserves a second chance from a lot of people. My second purpose with making this video was to highlight how I feel she was mishandled. I think it's something that a lot of people know. Even a lot of people who do not like Hiyoko will admit that she just was not handled the best. But I just really wanted to show how she could have gone down as a more beloved character had she been handled better. I feel like she should be studied and seen as an example of how Danganronpa's format can kind of screw over a really great concept for a character. I mean, really, just I kind of have to say it. Hiyoko Saionji is an enigma of a character, and she's also my favorite in the franchise, and that's saying a lot. Now, back to your regularly scheduled outro. Did you guys enjoy this? It's my first non-Yu-Gi-Oh video, so it was a bit challenging there, but also from the standpoint that this is more of an analytical and opinionated video compared to most of the other stuff I've made. For the Danganronpa fans, I regret to inform you that my next video will indeed be another Yu-Gi-Oh one, but I'm definitely not opposed to doing more videos on this series in the future. But for now though, this has been Emerald, going forth and not looking back.